Thank you so much for coming today. Because I have a 4-year-old, I'm just going to go ahead and keep this mask on just in case. Also, unless people have like clarification questions, if we could reserve most of the questions for the end. I have a lot of data and I hope I can get through it all. And then I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'm just going to start with an example here. So I'm an academic mama. And one time on this website that I'm involved in, or this group on Facebook, someone shared a tweet where a mom of color basically told a story about her daughter being on the playground and 2 white children approaching her daughter and basically telling her that they didn't want to play with her because she had dark brown skin and she didn't have blonde hair. And the mom said that she sort of looked over to see what was happening, looked at the moms of those children to see how they would respond, and they never said anything. They just ignored what happened. And so she basically said that she had to go home and explain to her daughter what had happened, how the way that she looks is not bad, and that she's beautiful as well. And that sometimes children say not so nice things just because people look different, but that isn't a good thing, right? And she was very frustrated by the fact that the parents didn't speak up. And of course, a lot of the comments on Twitter were about the fact that the parents had sort of intentionally taught their children to be racist, et cetera, with the lack of understanding that there are sort of systemic biases, right? And information that children are exposed to daily that sort of suggests that certain groups are to be valued over others, whether the parents are explicitly teaching them or not. And so to that end, it's really important as a result for white parents to sort of push back actively and to actively be anti-racist and to talk to their children about race. And so if you were to just do a quick Google search, you'll see that there are a ton of headlines, right? So we need more white parents to talk to their kids about race, especially now. White parents talk to your kids about race, et cetera. And these have been headlines that have been more prevalent in 2021 after the murder of George Floyd. And yet, there are very few studies that have done empirical investigations of how we can get parents to talk to their children about race, and specifically the positive or negative consequences of these methods and how to encourage it. So in my research program with my lab and collaborators, we have sought over the last few years to understand how white parents currently discuss race and racism with their children. We've sought to examine how these discussions shape children's racial biases and other outcomes. And we hope to apply this knowledge in an experimental intervention. So we started to do some work with dyads in the lab, but we hope to continue this work further. So we know from the literature that these discussions among white parents are relatively rare, and they often include things like colorblind messages. So basically saying things like race doesn't matter, or just avoiding discussing race altogether, right? But many of the samples that had been collected over the last decade or so were in relatively younger samples. And so in my work, I've sought to investigate this question in older samples of children. And we know that even when parents are brought into the lab and they're asked to talk about race, they tend to report low numbers, or when they're brought into the lab, they are very unlikely to have conversations. So people have basically tried to set parents up with methods to get them to have these conversations. And in some studies, numbers as low as 5% have actually gone on to have these conversations. So despite the lack of conversation that happens in these studies, many white parents actually express that they think this is something they should be doing. And they also say that to some extent, they fear that if they try to do it, they would mess it up. They feel like they need more information about how to do these things. And so in some of our research, more recently, we have been trying to understand what's the content of these conversations, in particular as it relates to recent current events. Who are the parents who are having these conversations? If they're not, what are the reasons why, et cetera. So with this first study that we conducted, this was specifically around the time of the Charleston shooting and some of the early Black Lives Matter protests. And for this particular study, we recruited 168 white parents of children between the ages of 8 and 12. We specifically chose this age because this is an age when children basically are less likely to start self-report their explicit negative attitudes for Black people, but their implicit negative attitudes remain. They also start using more colorblind language during this time. So again, this was recruited within 10 days. The participants were recruited within 10 days of the Charleston shooting. So the prompts included, what would you say if your child asked you about race? What would you say to your child if you witnessed together an incident in which someone experienced prejudice due to their race? And we asked them to describe if they had discussed recent current events related to race, such as events related to Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, the Charleston shooting. And if they had not discussed it, why not? And so what we found in this sample in 2015 was quite comparable to some other studies that had been done with other samples, right? That were relatively smaller samples, but even after this first sort of set of protests and so forth, we found that a little over a third of parents were saying they were having these conversations. And among those who did have these discussions, we found that a good percentage of them were actually having more color conscious conversations, so being explicit about race and racism, but also a little over half were using colorblind messages. But this is among only the 37% who were doing it. So colorblind would be, I tried to teach her not to see race. Another one would be, we discussed how people are far too sensitive about things such as race and how events can be taken out of context and blown out of proportion. So this person is specifically and explicitly saying, even in these contexts, right, race does not matter. And more color conscious messaging would be something like, I tell my child not to be colorblind because that erases the oppression faced by people of color. And I start by discussing and reading books with children that showcase diversity. So these are examples of self-reports among those 37% of parents regarding the kinds of conversations they were having. But if we think of the other, the other parents in the sample who said they were not having conversations, when we look at what they were doing, we found something more nuanced than just the idea of them fearing they would mess it up. So the top 3 explanations for why they didn't want to have these conversations were things like shielding. So my child's too young to fully understand the situation. He's not ready to learn about hate in the world. And again, these are 8 to 12-year-olds. They were being passive, just saying it hasn't come up. Or some white parents just thought it wasn't necessary. No, I didn't think it was something she needed to know at the time. These things aren't important to me, right? And so some key takeaways that we observed from these qualitative data were that race and racism are relatively low priorities in many white families, at least among the sample that we had and among other samples that had been observed in the literature. And white parents' colorblind messaging and avoidance of discussing race, we know from the literature, may actually perpetuate bias. So essentially, when parents say things like race doesn't matter, it's confusing for children because they do observe differences out in the world. And so they actually end up making sort of internal attributions for these differences that they observe. So another question that we had, yes?
Could you just tell us where you recruited these?
Yeah, so these were just parents on NTERC. And so we've done things like NTERC, Qualtrics panels, and tried to get more nationally representative samples. But yeah, that's where these parents came from. So we were also interested in individual differences that might predict the kinds of parents who are willing to have these conversations. And as Edith said, I'm interested in this concept of racial bias awareness. So imagine that this is a parent, right, who's viewing her kid on the playground, and she's thinking about the fact that perhaps these stereotypes either have impacted how she perceives Black people or her child. This parent could completely lack awareness, right? So maybe these stereotypes are impacting her perceptions, but she's unaware of it. This parent could recognize her bias, but not feel particularly concerned. I have these stereotypes about Black children and Black people. That's not problematic. Or she could recognize her bias and feel concerned about that. And it's this parent in particular who I'm concerned about or interested in. And my research in general has investigated this question. How does this person differ from other people? And so my research team and I hypothesized that parents who were higher on this measure, that this would be predictive of the likelihood that they would have discussions about race, as well as the kind of content. So I believe this individual difference is important because not only is it picking up on people's awareness of the fact that they may have the propensity to be biased, but also a concern about it. And also I think there's something important about a person who's willing to self-report that they have this kind of awareness. So I'll just briefly say this is my scale that I created in 2015. Even though I know it's not appropriate, I sometimes feel I hold unconscious negative attitudes toward Blacks. When talking to Black people, I sometimes worry that I am unintentionally acting in a prejudiced way. Even though I like Black people, I still worry that I have unconscious biases toward Blacks, and I never worry that I may be acting in a subtly prejudiced way toward Black people. So these are specifically questions related to these kinds of unconscious negative attitudes that might be impacting people's daily behaviors. They're aware of this, but they are concerned about the potential expressions of them. So again, going back to the sample that I talked about earlier, we specifically were trying to code information related to the content and whether they had had discussions. So if they discussed the current events, yes or no, whether the content indicated they were acknowledging racism. So these are actual quotes. So one parent, for example, said racism is deeply embedded in American culture. Whether they were denying racism. So for example, saying things like people are dividing our nation with lies about race. And we specifically were interested in whether this individual difference predicted the extent to which parents would have these conversations and the content. So we expected that parents who were higher in awareness, as that increased, they'd be more likely to say yes compared to no to discussing race. And that is what we found. So these other variables that we have are other things that might be predictive of discussing race. So internal motivations to respond without prejudice. So is it personally important to you to not be prejudiced? External motivation. So are you basically only non-prejudiced because you're afraid of how people will perceive you? And as one might expect, as IMS increased, people were more likely to say yes compared to no. And as EMS increased, they were more likely to say no compared to yes. We also looked at interracial anxiety, feeling thermometer, which is how cold versus warm people feel toward Black individuals, and parents self-reported friendships of non-white people. So basically, we looked at a number of different racial groups. So few parents had non-white friends that we just collapsed across such that it was 1 non-white, 0 white. And so you can see here that the child's friends, the parent's friends, and the amount of interracial contact did not predict those outcomes. Okay. So going back to that quote I showed as an example, so we specifically expected that as parents' bias awareness increased, they would be less likely to use language denying racism. And that's what we found. The other variables were not predicting this outcome. And then lastly, we expected that as bias awareness increased, that parents would be more likely to acknowledge or use language acknowledging racism. And that's what we found. So we found a positive relation there. And we also found that parents' internal motivations to respond without prejudice were predicting the likelihood of these things happening. So obviously these aren't huge effects, right? But there is some evidence here that there is a relation between this individual difference and these tendencies. So to summarize those data, we found that bias-aware parents were more likely to discuss race with their children, less likely to deny racism, and more likely to acknowledge that racism exists. However, among this sample, there are some limitations, right? So people were self-reporting that these were the kinds of conversations they had had, or that these are the kinds that they would. Their children were not actually present, and they were sort of reflecting on what they would do, right? And thinking about sort of retrospectively what happened. So in our lab, we started to wonder, is there a way that we can sort of test and develop a method that would facilitate conversation? So specifically, if we provide parents with explicit prompts to discuss race with their children, will they do it? And we started to think about some of the things that had happened in the past with other studies. They tended to be really subtle in terms of the way that they were trying to get parents to talk about race. So for example, zebras, and for one set of zebras, the stripes fall off and they turn black. One set, the stripes fall off and they turn white. And now kids discuss these books, and let's hope that race comes up, right, when you're having these discussions. And these are younger children, right? So I would assume that researchers probably thought perhaps it's going to be difficult if we try to get parents to explicitly talk about race beyond these animals. But that's a study where 5% of parents talked about race, right? Like it wasn't really something that sort of made it obvious. And so What we did is we brought 83 parent-child dyads into the lab. It's important to note that this is between 2018 and 2020, with most of the data actually being collected in 18 and 19. We just haven't been able to get them in the lab post-pandemic. So I think this is important because a lot of times when I talk about these data, people are like, well, what was the current sort of setting and so forth? So obviously parents at this point are a little bit less sort of actively focused on these conversations. They're from the greater Chicago area. And again, we're focusing on 8 to 12-year-olds, and the majority of parents who signed up to come in were mothers, which is pretty common in this kind of research. It's also important to know, I don't have that information here, but these were relatively educated individuals, relatively liberal, and this is also something that's sort of a limitation in much of this research. Okay. So before we actually put this method into place, we actually piloted the method with a sample of over 100 undergrads. So we just basically developed this method to facilitate conversation. And it's kind of awkward, but we had the undergrads just sit in the room and view these videos that we created. And we had these prompts and we just said, okay, talk out loud about what's happening in the video, right? And I'll show you what the prompts are. And we found a lot of variability in terms of what people talked about, their nonverbal behaviors, kind of language they used, how comfortable they were. So we felt pretty certain that if we brought a dyad into the room, that we would actually get people to talk. And so these videos were depicting interracial interactions between Black and white children that were either subtle or overt. And these lay theories, basically these lay examples of racism were informed by previous research in which researchers had basically asked people to come up with a bunch of different examples of what racism might look like, and then sort of categorize them as more subtle or blatant, and we made them more kid-friendly, right? So the prompts that we used were theory-driven. So much of the literature on ways that we can perhaps encourage people to use more color-conscious language or perhaps reduce prejudice is to get people to mention race when racist acts occur, to try to offer attributions for the prejudiced act, so who actually engaged in this behavior, right? To encourage empathy and perspective taking with the victims, and to get parents to point out prejudice with their child when it occurs. And so we tried to form our prompts around this. So I'm just going to show you examples of the subtle and blatant videos. All right, let's see if this works. Oh.
Mom feels uncomfortable around Black people. The other day, when he was interacting with Adam, he felt nervous.
Okay. So one form of subtle bias that was sort of generated by lay people was the idea that you feel anxious around Black people, right? So that's an example there. And then here's a more blatant example.
Jamie tells her friends that they should not play with Black kids. The other day, she told Samantha not to play with Justin.
Okay, and that's something more blatant, right? So sort of outward exclusion. And we figured that these are things, right, that 8 to 12-year-olds will have experienced. And there's literature to show that by this time, by middle childhood, many Black children have experienced discrimination. And so here are prompts that are informed by the literature. I don't know if you all can see these very well. I'll just walk you through it. So it's the example that Tiffany thinks all Black kids are dumb. The other day when the teacher wasn't looking, she called Casey stupid. So we asked the parents for 2 minutes per video to just take some time to discuss. And here are some prompts. Here are some things you might discuss. So do you think that there was something wrong with Tiffany's behavior? How do you think Tiffany's behavior made Casey feel? And how would you feel if you were Casey? Why do you think Tiffany did what she did? And do you think that Tiffany's behavior was prejudiced? And the way that we defined it is prejudice is when someone has a negative opinion of someone because of the group they belong to, okay? And so what we did was we content coded some of the things that the parents said, just to try to understand the kinds of conversations that were coming up. And so we transcribed everything, and then we started to pull out some of the themes. And so some of the themes that popped up were positive, and some of them were actually relatively negative. So here's an example of one where parents were actually showing a little bit of defensiveness. So these are specifically data for parents. So S is subtle and B is blatant. So for the example, Tom feels uncomfortable around Black people. The other day he was interacting with Adam. Here's an example of how parents sometimes gave the white child the benefit of the doubt. So why do you think Tom did what he did? Well, maybe he has some history. This is the child. Or like, and the parent says, yeah, maybe he has something on him. And the kid says, because he was like a teammate and they bullied him or something. And the parent says, yeah. And then the child says, I don't think. And the parent says, maybe he's just nervous around other people, like in general. We don't know specifically. And then the child pushes back. No, it said Black people. And the mom says, the video said Black people, but he never said anything in the video, right? And so we were pretty shocked by some of these things. I mean, obviously, it wasn't the case that an overwhelming majority of parents did something like this. But it was the case that sometimes, right, even when it was really clear what was happening and the child was aware, the parent was uncomfortable and pushed back a bit about what was happening. But a tiny percent of parents, very few, who actually blamed the Black child for what happened. So Chris thinks that Black people tend to be troublemakers. When something goes missing from his desk at school, he blames it on Jacob. So this parent says, but the other boy, Jacob, a super friendly kid and never did anything wrong. And then the kid says, yeah, but Jacob could have been a super duper. And the mom says, I mean, there could have been a time Jacob did take something from somebody else, possibly. The kid says, maybe because he found it on the ground and he thought it was his. Mom says, that's true too. So the mom is implying basically that maybe this kid did at some point steal something. And you can see how the kid's trying to work through it and saying, well, yeah, maybe he accidentally did something, right? Like, let's not assume that the child actually intentionally took something. And some parents tended to make external attributions, which may be positive or negative, right? So if you blame it on something else, perhaps that's not such a good thing. But also if we're thinking about systemic racism, right? There are sort of things in our environment that are at play that might be predicting this. So Chris thinks that Black people tend to be troublemakers. When something goes missing from his desk, he blames it on Jacob. And the parent says, how do you think he learned that? And the child says, and then the parent says, maybe from his parents, or he overheard his parents say something. And the child says, maybe he just sees a lot of stuff on YouTube or something, or maybe he sees it in real, and he just thinks that. And the parent says, yeah, I guess after a while, but that's not. And then the video moves on. So this is an example, right, of the parent blaming it on parents. And again, this can be true, right? But it's also really important for the parent and the child to reflect on how the child has some ownership over what's happening as well. However, despite some of those negative things that we observed, we also found some things that we think are pretty promising. For example, a large majority, especially in the blatant condition of parents, actually pointed out the prejudice that was occurring. So for the one where Tom feels uncomfortable around Black people, the parent says, do you think Tom's behavior was prejudice? Prejudice is when someone has a negative opinion of someone because of the group they belong to. And the child says, no, not at all. I just think he's just uncomfortable because he might have been new to Black people. The mom makes a face and the kid goes, why? What, mom? And the mom says, well, like, does it matter? Child says, no, like, it doesn't matter if he's feeling a little nervous. And the mom says, it's okay to be nervous about different people. But if the only reason is because they look different, the child says, I don't think. And the mom says, what if Teo was nervous around you because you look different than her? How would that make you feel? And the child says, a little disappointed. Mom says, yeah. The kid says, now I see. She says, now you see? You want to play it one more time? And then so forth. So this mom is really pushing back, right? The kid's saying, no, I don't think prejudice is occurring. And she's really walking her child through it to express actually something did occur. We also found that way more parents mention race than in previous studies. So for example, this is one in which the video suggests that a child thinks that all Black kids look alike, and it gets two Black children mixed up. And the mom says, yeah, I guess he needed a pencil and he wanted to ask James for a pencil, but instead asked Alex because he was having a hard time. She's telling the child to sit down. She says he had a hard time. He had a hard time telling Black people apart. So he knew the mistake there, I guess. So what do you think about it? Do you think you'd have a hard time telling Black people apart? The child says, maybe a little. And the mom says, why do you think that is? So she's specifically mentioning that this is something that occurred because the child is Black, right? And then prompting her child to sort of reflect on why that's the case. And so we also saw some more explicit connections to societal racism. So the goal with this study really was to get more parents to do this, right? Very few parents did. And so we saw more parents pointing out prejudice, using language related to race and mentioning race, but only a small percentage going beyond that. So this is a relatively long quote, but I think it's really powerful. So the parent says, so his behavior was prejudiced, and the child says, yeah. And not only was that, it was violent. Can we watch it again, the child says. So the parent says, yeah, we can watch it again. That's really sad. Sometimes in our society, white people do hurt Black people. It makes me sad. Like sometimes, you know how sometimes the police are more likely to shoot a teenager if it's a Black boy, even if he's doing nothing wrong. So it's actually kind of dangerous to be a Black boy in our society. And so they're realizing the video is sort of moving on, but the parent says, can we keep talking? So what if you had a Black son? What if you were an adult and you had a Black boy that was growing up? What do you think you would tell them? And then the child says, I'd tell them they're good. And the mom says, well, yeah, but how do you think you would have to prepare them for how society might treat them? So they sort of go on to talk about how this child has friends at school and how would the child feel if his friends were treated negatively, et cetera, even though they're good people. And so obviously this mother is sort of specifically talking about racism within society, the impact it has on Black children, and having her child put himself in the shoes of this child if he were to experience that. So a much smaller percentage of parents were using colorblind messaging. That was observed previously. So one parent said you could be white and a troublemaker, you could be Black and a troublemaker. I don't think it makes a difference, right? Even though the prompt specifically says that this person thinks that Black people are troublemakers, right? And there also was a small percentage who were redirecting away from race. So do you think Nathan's behavior was prejudiced? The child says yes. And the parent says, okay, let me ask you something. Could a kid be picking on a kid? Could a white kid pick on a Black kid without it being a race issue? Could it be about the person? And the child says, yeah, some people are just that way. And they might also pick on white kids. Okay, so again, we've been really explicit about what's happening, but the parents redirecting, right? And saying, no, like maybe it's not about race. Okay, so we can see from these data that a lot more parents were having conversations. Many were actually having conversations that were about pointing out prejudice, right? Very few were really being anti-racist, but we are seeing lower sort of percentages of colorblind language and avoidance. But what's important beyond this is we wanted to know, okay, if we had these parents come into the lab and have these conversations, do we actually see attitude change, right? So in theory, based on what we know about implicit negative attitudes, even though there's some evidence to suggest that if you can shift these attitudes around, perhaps it may or may not predict change in behavior, what we do know is that environment is important. And one of the reasons why it's been suspected that shifts in implicit negative attitudes aren't necessarily strongly predicting behavior is because people go right back to the same environment that they were in before, right? And if you actually shift the environment and the culture, then you can see people's implicit negative attitudes go down. And so I just want to start with that because I'm going to talk about implicit negative attitudes. And my argument here is if we see some change, even though it's momentary, you can imagine if we are able to increase the likelihood that parents are having these conversations consistently, right? Perhaps it will have a larger impact. Okay, so in this particular study, while we're having these kids have conversations, that we had kids and parents have conversations, before the study, we measured the parents and the child's implicit negative attitudes, as well as the kids. And these were kid and adult specific IATs. That's what's really important. These are two different measures, but they're picking on their preferences, picking up on their preferences for white compared to Black individuals. Okay, so the first question we had is, are these attitudes correlated when parents and kids come into the lab? Because there actually were no data specifically looking at if a kid and a parent takes the IAT, do you see correlations between attitudes? Some people had looked at explicit attitudes or a combination of parents implicit and kids explicit. So here's what we found. We found that when they came into the lab, there actually was not a correlation. And there are a number of things that might explain this. So some literature suggests, for example, that parents' attitudes, so kids' perceptions of their parents' attitudes are more strongly correlated with parents' attitudes and parents' actual attitudes. So to that end, you would expect that if it's about perception, perhaps post-conversation, this relation would get stronger, right? And that's what we found. We found that after they had a conversation, that parents and children's implicit negative attitudes, even though they were separate measures, became more strongly correlated. And what's important here to note is that pre to post conversation, parents' own implicit negative attitudes as measured through the IAT were still strongly correlated, but kids' attitudes were no longer strongly correlated with their pre-attitudes. They were more strongly correlated with the parents' attitudes. And if you look at these little plots, basically what we see is that the kids are more strongly aligning with the parents pre to post, right? And so the second question that we had, so this was sort of an exploratory question, the main question was, do we see attitude change pre to post conversation, right? And so we indeed found that between before the conversation compared to after, both parents, the orange line, and children, the black line, their implicit negative attitudes decreased. And it's reasonable to say this. Some people have argued, well, they both took the IAT twice, maybe that's why it's decreasing. So we actually were able to look at some data that were collected around the same time, same age range, 8 to 12, by James Ray and Christina Olsen. So Christina Olsen, sort of her, academic advisor was Mazarine Banaji, so she does a lot of work on the IAT with kids. And specifically, comparable to our sample, she had kids who were 8 to 12 take the IAT. 2 hours later, they took it again, and she saw no statistical difference, significant difference between pre to post. And actually, her post effect size was very comparable to ours, around 0.4. And this effect size of 0.16 is basically moving in the direction of little to no preference for either group. So it's not moving in the direction of pro-Black, it's just reducing such that the children are showing little to no preference, right, post-conversation. So our broader questions were, if we provide parents with explicit prompts, will they discuss race with their children at higher rates? And we found some evidence that they will. And if parents do have these discussions, will we later see attitude change? And so what's really important to point out here, obviously, is I'm not looking at, because of specific content, did we see attitude change? It's really just before the conversation compared to after, did we see any changes, right? This broad question, and we do have some evidence of that. And so we think that this is sort of some promising evidence that guided color conscious conversations, like the one we utilized here, potentially can help reduce racial biases across multiple generations. Actually, I'm gonna pause before I read this quote. So before I go on to sort of finish up and say more about this, as well as potentially show you a little bit more data because we have time. I just want to share a quote with you, reflecting back on the beginning when I talked about the parents who were on the playground and what happened. So I was on Twitter the other day, as I am, and I saw that a Black academic mama, I'll just describe her that way, had an experience out in the world with her children that to me sort of signaled the fact that Black children live in a different reality, right, from white children day to day. And here's what she said happened. So she says, I was just in a store with my kids and husband when an argument broke out between a white man and Black woman. She was quiet but firm in her affect. He was aggressive, started yelling the N-word at her. Most of the Black folks looked upset, but composed. I mean, we live this life in the skin, in the hate, and that man's words is nothing new. But my kids had never quite encountered that before. We were enjoying our Sunday afternoon, and here comes racism, stealing our peace. And so I thought this was like a really powerful thing to read about because, when you look at the quotes and the parents in our sample, many of them basically say, hey, like, I just think this would be harmful to my kids to talk about these things, right? Like, I don't want to talk to them about race and racism. systemic racism, the history of slavery, because I want to keep my child innocent for a little bit longer about how harsh these things are. But the thing is, many Black parents don't want to have these conversations a lot of times either, right? They also want to protect their children and not talk to them about the harsh realities of racism. But unfortunately, many of us are thrown into a situation where we don't have a choice, and we have to explain to our children why someone would do something hateful and treat someone that way just because of how they look. And so to me, that just suggests the importance, right, of white parents stepping up and having these conversations about race and racism, given that this is the reality for many people of color. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about some limitations of my work, right? So our study did provide these prompts, right, to facilitate conversation. And despite the fact that we had these prompts, there were actually very few parents who were sort of actively pushing back and using anti-racist language. And so while it's a start that the parents are pointing out prejudice, they were mentioning race specifically, it's also the case that if we really want to move the needle, right, and get children and parents to be actively anti-racist, that language needs to be built into the conversation. It's also the case that we can't directly compare our sample to previous samples. So I'm making an argument that we're seeing higher levels of discussion, but many of the previous studies were done, earlier years. And so it's quite possible that that might explain it, not to mention the fact that it's its own unique sample. Also, all of the parents were not well-meaning, right? And we're not saying that overtly racist discussions would be beneficial, or that our method is beneficial all the time. So there's been some pushback in the literature, basically, where someone wrote an article saying, hey, we don't necessarily know that these conversations are beneficial. When researchers are telling parents they should be having these conversations and what they should be talking about, this isn't necessarily based on empirical evidence. So maybe we are doing more harm than good. And so we're certainly not arguing, right, that any conversation, irrespective of content, is beneficial. That's an important thing to know. So with future directions in our lab, we want to investigate whether parents engaging with their child in the context of semi-structured race discussion tasks will impact their longer-term behavior and willingness to engage with their child on the topic of race. So specifically interventions in which we, across multiple time points, investigate whether this has some sort of benefit. In addition, we want to try to share these data with key stakeholders, but we need to sort of have a better proof of concept, right? So people have reached out to me before and said, like, can you come to our school to show us how to do this better? My general answer is, I can tell you about the data, but I can't fix it. Because, one thing that Betsy Levy-Pollock, who is a researcher at Princeton, a full professor there, has said that we have to be really careful with these interventions, right? And make sure that we have a really strong grasp on what we're doing and whether they're working before we try to scale them up and implement them into the world. So I want to end-ish, because we have a little bit of time potentially, by plugging all of the papers that I've been working on over the last several years on this topic. So these are all on PsyArchive. Some of them are published, some of them are not. And I always like to say some of these papers are revise and resubmit, but we all know that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get published yet. And so you can go to my website to read about this work. I also want to thank all of my collaborators, so my former postdoc, Allison Skinner, my former graduate student, James Wages, who just graduated and got to move back home to Arkansas and start a professorship job. I'm really excited for him. Emily Blevins, who was a graduate student at UIUC, who would come during the summer to help us run the study because we didn't want any Black people in the room. So she would come and help us, and now she's at Emory. Jamie Abide, who's been my collaborator since I was at the University of Vermont. Sarah Waters, who's at Washington State and knows a lot of amazing information about nonverbal behavior and psychophys. And I obviously didn't share any of those data with you today, but I'm happy to talk about it. Adelanio Sanaya, who was my former lab manager, is now a grad student at Purdue. And lastly, my lab, and if you want to go to the website, you can go to skiplab.com. So in there, but I have a little bit more data. And I'm wondering if I should talk about that or if, okay, cool. All right, so the last sort of chunk of data that I talked about was specifically about data that we had collected around the time of the Charleston shooting, right? And so more recently, we actually wanted to collect more data. So we collected some data in 2020 and some in 2021, specifically 2 samples using Qualtrics panels. And of white parents, we actually collected some data from Black parents as well. And we wanted to know if there had been any change in terms of content of conversations and the frequency with which parents were discussing race, given all the sort of social justice related things that have been going on. So we did find that these numbers were increasing. So not surprisingly, Black parents are having discussions, right? But we found that 77% of white parents in 2020 said they were having conversations compared to 2019, right? Which is 40%. So roughly about the same percentage that said they were having conversations in 2015, as well as the other studies that had come previously. So we did see a huge bump up, right, in 2020. However, some of these things were good and some not so good. So here's some examples. The latest protests against police violence toward African Americans didn't appear out of nowhere. They are rooted in generations of injustice and systemic racism. So we saw more examples of these kinds of comments. So we supported the protests, but not the violence, and felt quite concerned about our safety as white people and fear for family members that are in law enforcement. So some people really sort of reflecting on how it might impact them as opposed to the reasons behind these movements. And this is this own person spelling. If you're not doing something wrong, you're not putting yourself in the position to get killed by the police. So obviously this is a statement that is really stressful and sad to hear because this parent really isn't recognizing the reality of how many of these people are just living their lives, right, and encountering these situations. One parent says, we discussed and cried together about how horrible it is that innocent people are killed by police and people still turn blind eyes. Another said, he told me about this and I told him that it's sad, but police brutality is not directed toward Black people only. Okay. Bad cops in some cases, bad people in some cases, not all cases one way or the other, not necessarily racial. So more parents, right, talking about things in anti-racist ways in the sample, but we also saw more overt racism and more sort of redirecting away from racial issues in the sample. So it seemed way more polarized than our previous samples. But here's something we also found. We titled this paper, Talking More but Saying Less. That's the beginning of the paper. We found that even though there were sort of a higher percentage of parents really actively pushing back, 47% of our sample really couldn't be coded as a specific ideology because they were simply saying things like, we discussed it, or it came up. And so essentially, we're not really sure if this is how it should be framed, but it almost seemed performative, right? Like parents are saying, oh yes, we're having these conversations, but when pushed to actually say the content, they couldn't actually generate much of anything. And so a big chunk of our sample was doing this. We also actually found across all of these samples that some parents were delivering mixed messages. And what that means is that on the one hand, sometimes they were saying things that were color conscious, right? Talking about race. And on the other hand, they were simultaneously saying things like, but race doesn't matter. And so they may have potentially been undoing the benefits, right, of using this more color conscious focused language, which, is undermining their intentions. Okay, so I will end there.